And good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Progressive Magazine and A Room of One's Own bookstore hosting this live virtual book event tonight with Dave Zirin and Bill Leaders of the Progressive Magazine. Thanks, everybody, so much for joining us tonight, and we will have, I think, a very great conversation for you. We're going to go for about an hour, and Bill and Dave are going to talk for a while, and then we're going to take your questions at the end. The best way to get questions to us is to use the chat feature on either your YouTube or your Facebook. So chat those questions throughout the program, and then we'll be answering those at the end. Also, if you'd like to get a copy of the book, The Kaepernick Effect, you can make a donation to the Progressive Magazine at progressive.org/book event. And that's book-event. And that'll take you to a place where you can make a donation to support the Progressive Magazine and get a copy of this book mailed to your home. The Progressive Magazine is a 112-year-old political magazine based here in Madison, Wisconsin. This is our most recent issue, which looks at the future of school. And if you go to our website and click on progressive.org/subscribe, you can subscribe and get our next issue, which is going to be coming out in just about 10, 12 days or so. And also, the Progressive Magazine is supported through your generous donations. So please consider making a donation to support the Progressive Magazine at progressive.org/donate. And I also want to thank A Room of One's Own bookstore, local bookstore here in Madison, Wisconsin, that has co-sponsored a number of these events with us with very interesting and provocative authors and topics. And you can visit them at roomofone'sown.com. Might be Room of One's Own bookstore. I'll have to look for that in a minute. And they are just moving to a new location. So it's very exciting things happening for Room of One's Own. Right now, I'd like to bring on the screen with me our two guests. I want to give a very warm welcome first of all, to Bill Leaders, the editor of the Progressive Magazine. Welcome, Bill.
Hi, good to be here.
And also our guest and author of the book we're going to be hearing from tonight, Dave Zirin, sports columnist for The Nation, sports columnist for The Progressive, host of the Edge of Sports podcast, and so much more. Dave Zirin, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
I only wish I was in Madison to support your beer and cheese-based economy.
So, well, let's do it, Dave.
Let's do it. I think Norm just threw us in the water.
So this is your 11th book. The Kaepernick Effect is a collection of stories about athletes who have taken the knee in response to the example of Colin Kaepernick in 2016. There are some who are at the high school level, some at the college level, and some at the professional level. I think there's about 36 athlete stories altogether, and several of coaches at the collegiate level. And each one gets to tell their own story and to explain why they were motivated to take a knee. I see this as different, in structure, certainly from your other books, but I don't think I'm going out on a limb too far to say that the book of yours that probably comes closest to the Kaepernick Effect is the book, The John Carlos Story, which is about another act of public protest where John Carlos and Tommy Smith engaged in a defiant act of resistance at the 1968 Olympics, thrusting their fists in the air as a protest. Both of these books are about these acts of resistance by Black athletes. I know you see a connection between the two because you interviewed John Carlos for the Kaepernick Effect.
Yep.
How are these two events alike, you think, and how are they different?
Well, the best way, first, it's great to be here. The best way to answer that is to just tell the story of the motivation for this book. Like how it actually started came out of a discussion I was in with John Carlos. Because we became very close through the writing of his memoir, and so we stay in touch regularly. And then one day we were just hanging out, and he said to me, you know, there were so many people who raised their fists at track meets after Tommy and I did that at the Olympics. And, you know, the historian part of me, you know, I was a history major in college. The historian part of me just, my head just went like a mushroom, because I was like, who were these people? Who raised their fist? How did it affect their lives? What are they doing today? And then I really sat with it, and I was like, wow, that was over 50 years ago. So, you know, finding those folks and being able to cohere something out of their experience seemed impossible. But it really made me think about all the young people who are taking a knee, and that kind of electric effect of an athlete really giving, not so much not so much like a copycat thing where you say, ooh, the athlete does it, so I'm going to do it, but much more like giving a language or a method for struggle and protest. Like if you take a knee somewhere during the anthem, everybody knows why you're doing it. You know, that's the ubiquity and the generosity of this gesture. It's something that's been given to a whole generation of athlete activists. If you're upset about police brutality, if you're upset about racism, but you live in Beaumont, Texas, where football is a religion, but at the same time, it's not like you can walk out of your door in Beaumont, Texas and go to the nearest Black Lives Matter demonstration. Here is something that you can do. You know, you're on the football team, you take that knee. So that was like the whole reason at first I wanted to do the book. But then summer of 2020 happens. The police murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. Two things about that. I mean, the first was that everybody saw it, the incredible juxtaposition of Colin Kaepernick taking this knee as a peaceful gesture against police violence, and then this police officer on one knee as well in an act of terrible violence and racism. And you know, that juxtaposition just, I think, rocked people. You saw it on signs at demonstrations. People were comparing and contrasting all over the place. Also, those demonstrations were the biggest demonstrations in the history of the United States, numerically, and in terms of the number of every state had a demonstration after Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd. And I went back and I talked to a lot of the people who I'd interviewed already. And what was amazing to me is that they were all totally politically engaged. Some were street organizers. And so that made me realize that while many roads may have led to the summer of 2020, one of those roads runs straight through the athletic fields of the United States.
Yeah, taken as a whole, these 36 or 40 people that you interview, what do you think they all agree on, and where did they diverge?
I mean, first of all, it's like a lot of their stories diverge on the basis, on a lot of different bases. Like, are they in a more liberal area or is it a more conservative area? Does the coach have their back, or does the coach stab them in the back? Do their teammates take seriously the idea of a team being family and therefore supporting them? Or do the teammates immediately turn on the individual who engages in this kind of peaceful protest? How do white teammates respond if you're at a predominantly white institution? You know, these are all, I mean, someone told me that the book should be called What to Expect When You're Protesting, because it gives people a lot of windows into a lot of different avenues of how this can go if you want to protest as well.
But it's very different, though. For some, they received a great deal of support and acceptance among their peers and others on the team that they're from, and some were ostracized, some were threatened, some had to do it on their own without the support of anyone.
Exactly. So you've got that diversity of experience. One of the things that was really a common thread through all of it, the two things really stand out for me. Well, actually three. The first thing I would say is this sense of optimism. Like, nobody regretted what they did. There was this real wholehearted sense of, like, yes, like the times called upon me to do something and I did it, even if people did this, that, or the other to me, it was worth it. That was one thing, that spirit. And that's really made me much more optimistic about the future than I was before I started this book. The book is a good 50 cc's of optimism in that regard. The second thing is the invocation of the name Trayvon Martin. I found that to be really, really interesting. When you think about, say I'm talking to a 19-year-old, that means Trayvon Martin is murdered when you're 10 years old. And 10 years old is like you're old enough to know what's going on and young enough to ask why it has to be that way. And that marked a lot of these young folks in a very significant way, something that reminded me of the stories you see in Eyes on the Prize about how the lynching of Emmett Till shaped a generation of civil rights activists. I felt that in their heartfelt connection to what happened to Trayvon Martin, and how no matter what was happening in their lives, no matter how inspired they were about Colin Kaepernick, no matter what instances of police violence may have taken place in their own communities, they all hearken back also to Trayvon Martin as sort of like the amplifier and explainer for why they were the way they were. And so that was a really important connection. And the last one is, like either fear or the actual specter of violence in just about all these cases. And that's something that says just to me a great deal about the state of politics in this country. It's like this idea of, we don't like what you have to say, therefore, us, small government conservatives will pass laws to prevent you from teaching it. We will have you fired if you're seen as propagating it. And oh, by the way, you kids who take a knee, we're going to kick you off the team, and we're going to threaten you with violence because we don't like what you have to say. Like that, there is no let's, disagree without being disagreeable. Like that's fossilized compared to what young people are dealing with when they dare step out politically.
Yeah. Are there some people you interviewed that you ended up not using?
Yeah, a lot of people, but it was never because of any reason other than the fact that I wanted to make sure there was ultimate diversity and balance. And I also didn't want the book to be too long because I didn't want people to sort of feel like it was getting repetitive, because there are similar beats to the stories, but I really wanted it to feel fresh in people's hands and distinct. So, and I wanted the book to be at a length where, and this is already happening, which makes me feel really good, but at a length where, like, say a high school teacher can get in touch with me and be like, can you zoom into the class? Cause I've got 20 kids reading this, or something like that. So it's not too thick, intimidating, what have you. Yeah. But so I really had my eyes set on a certain word count that I wanted it to be. So, then that meant something painful. But everybody who I interviewed, I sent a copy of the book and gave my heartfelt thanks.
What's the response been?
Great. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. This is like, I don't want to be. I don't want to exercise humility, because it's so damn rewarding to have heard back from the people I've spoken with. And, and I did some stuff, Bill, that was like maybe not necessarily as interesting practice that I don't normally exercise. But I figured the people that I spoke to were so young and they were trusting me with so much that I sent them what I wrote and said two things. One, did I get your story right? And two, do you want to back out? And I won't publish it. And of everybody I did that with, only one person pulled their interview. I mean, they were eager to get it out there. And most people just said, oh, it's fine. The only differences I got were like, ooh, you misspelled the name of my high school, or, stuff like that. And I was like grateful to them. I was like, thank you.
Of course.
For catching that. But they were just ready to rumble. They wanted their story out there. And, and also, like I've said to them that, and this is just true, like, because of their generosity and speaking to me and their sacrifice in terms of what they did, I was going to take anything I make from the book and give it to this mutual aid fund in DC that does amazing work with young people. So, that also has made them feel just really good, like it's all getting paid forward in terms of what they did. So they've been sending me pictures of themselves holding the book and showing it to friends and sending me texts, and it's been really nice.
You do honor them, and you honor their experience and telling their stories and explaining, their life story and their motivation. The stories all follow, similar, or many of them follow a similar arc of introducing us to an athlete and telling us how they were motivated to take this act of resistance of taking a knee and the sports that they're involved in, and the experience that they have. But the stories are all then substantially different because their experiences are different and the level of support that they receive are very different. Do you disagree with any of the people that you interviewed?
I mean, it's interesting. The people, I mean, this is just my own politics sort of imposing itself. This isn't so much a disagreement as a differing of analysis. So, you know, I can't really claim it as a disagreement, but the folks I spoke to who said that that they were kneeling against police brutality and racism, and, you know, kneeling during the anthem was a way to be heard and really has nothing to do with patriotism or the flag or anything like that. I mean, I say this as someone who 5,000% supports the right to protest when the national anthem is played. That, I mean, if you're protesting when the anthem is playing, that's absolutely a rebuke of I would argue, the promises that this country puts forward, and then the lived reality for far too many of its citizens, particularly Black and brown folks. And I think that's one of the things that enrages people, because they see it as an affront. I see it as a challenge. But whatever it is, it's a statement of not calling for peace, but calling for justice in the best possible tradition of this country and now globally. Because, you know, one thing about U.S. hegemony throughout the globe is, you know, we also export our methods of protest often, and the taking of the knee is no exception.
So it is international, of course. It was taken up all over the world. You don't interview anyone from other countries, though. You're all focused on people in the United States.
In that regard, I just wasn't having a lot of success speaking of getting through to folks and making those interviews happen. And I was inundated and overwhelmed with what I had. And so I didn't winnow it to athletes in the United States. But there's a globe for folks listening to this. There's a global book to be written, and goodness gracious, please get on that. You know, I really want to check out, you know, what's happening in Europe, because I was interviewed by an Irish reporter yesterday, and we got in this interesting debate about this, and I thought he was correct at the end, where, you know, in the book I do mention like how the soccer teams have this kind of like top down, like everybody's going to take a knee before the match, and it can look very sort of corporate orchestrated, like we're trying to look so progressive here, look at us, and not something that comes organically from the players themselves, and therefore it has less value. And he was talking to me about the amount of racism in the stands at a lot of these games being beyond what we even know in the United States. And the act of the players taking this knee has imposed a debate and a discussion on fan bases by doing this. And when he said that and talked about that process, it made me believe that they had more value than I was giving it credit for.
As you know, we're running an excerpt from the Kaepernick Effect and the issue of the Progressive that goes to press tomorrow, actually.
Thank you.
I thought, as I read through the book, of running a collection of quotes from various people, because so many of the people you interview have such, you know, touching and poignant things to say, that would have been a nice way to present what the feel of the book is, to give a collection of those quotes. But in the end, we ended up telling a single person's story, to just taking one of the stories that you tell. It was a college lacrosse player named Mink Richardson Clark at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois. It's really interesting, her story. She acts alone, has no support from her team, no support from her school, and she stands up for herself, and she challenges, and she stands up to the challenges that are brought against her. She just seems so very courageous. Do you feel that? I mean, that was a story that just struck me, with the person's courage.
Absolutely. I mean, the particularly, you know, you feel this. So it's another common thread that the athletes who I talk to, who are young and Black, and they are at predominantly white institutions, they're very aware of what the institution has lined up against them, and yet they stepped forward anyway. And there's a bravery about that too, because you're already at these schools an extreme minority, and you now find yourself in the position where you feel a responsibility to like wake a campus up, you know, or get them to acknowledge the seriousness of what's happening in the streets of this country. And you've now, because of what Colin Kaepernick did, you're given this language, this lexicon, this method by which you can do this. But far more interesting and frankly far more intense than the act of taking that knee is that fallout afterwards, where people line up and people have to decide. I'm struck by one story in the book of Mikhail, who was at Santa Barbara and then went to the University of Minnesota, and she was completely ostracized by her coach and treated terribly. And then when the summer of 2020 rolled around, her coach sent her this long email about how wrong she was to treat her this way, and how, you know, how she's come to this realization and changed as a human being. And that in and of itself, to me, was a very powerful story that Mikhail walks us through.
Yeah, the Mink Richardson clerk, the lacrosse players, there's a scene where she meets with her college president, who tells her in response to all the flack she's been getting that she has to learn how to defend herself. And she says, I know how to defend myself, but I shouldn't have to I shouldn't be put in a situation where I have to.
Yes.
It kind of drove home for me the point of the book, which shows that by taking a knee, these athletes are creating opportunities to explain their reality to others who really have no clue.
Yeah. And, you know, I start the book with this quote by my friend and colleague, Howard Bryant, fantastic sports writer. And I just think this is so powerful. He said this in an interview I did with Howard for my own podcast. He said, the kneeling gesture is the spot where America comes apart, where all the post 9/11 pro-police messaging and militarism at sporting events collides with the reality of the cops and military. In no other element of our culture is there such a clear and defiant single gesture like taking a knee. Where else are we allowed the space to say we disagree with our police? Where else can we register with one gesture dissent with the alleged ideals of this country? America is getting called out with this one gesture, and they are determined to punish anyone using it.
Yeah. That's one of the constants of the book, is that taking a knee or watching someone taking a knee makes some people angry. They say it's just not appropriate, or it's disrespectful, or it's divisive. And yet, as you note, they're doing this during the playing of the national anthem, which is a song written by a slave owner, Francis Scott Key. And it originally included a stanza about that celebrated the deaths of escaping slaves. You know, it's such a disconnect that people are angry at the protest, but not at the song.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And, this, it just relates directly to if I can throw it in here, this message on the side that we just got from Linda Falkenstein asking, how did the national anthem and other patriotic songs like God Bless America and the seventh inning stretch, for instance, get mixed up in commercial athletics, the NFL, NBA, MLB, etc.? Anyway, the Olympics or a World Cup have a nation relationship, but these do not. What's the deal? What's the deal indeed, Linda? It goes directly to what you were saying, Bill, and about the national anthem and Francis Scott Key being this not just racist, but this, the rockets, red glare, the bombs bursting in air, this very militaristic song. And, you don't have it emerge at sporting events until World War I. It was thought to be appropriate to be played there. Then they stop playing it, the major leagues, and they start playing it again during World War II. Then they really decide to keep the national anthem after World War II, and it becomes a constant staple, which in the context of the Cold War was, very much almost like an announcement that we are now in a permanent state of war, because we are going to play this at sporting events at all times, and patriotism is going to become something much more pronounced in the culture.
Yeah.
Which
And
was,
America the Beautiful, wasn't that introduced after 9/11?
yeah, in the seventh inning stretch of baseball games, a second anthem. It never got quite weirder than it did at Yankee Stadium, where a very aged George Steinbrenner had them put up chains on the bleachers to keep people from going to the bathroom or getting food during the seventh inning stretch and the playing of God Bless America. And that might have stayed, except one brave chap decided that having to pee was more important than the seventh inning stretch. So he steps over the chain, and walks to the bathroom, and he gets kicked out of the stadium by security. And with help from our friends in the ACLU, he sued them.
Huh.
And that's why they stopped putting chains up. But yeah, and I think that's a big reason why this has exploded on the scene. Everything that's in this book, this modern age revolt of the Black athlete. This is Howard Bryant's argument in his book, The Heritage, and he makes it very convincingly that the militarization that got stepped up after 9/11 in the ceremonies amplified what had always been a political space, playing of the anthem and the like, but amplified it to even another level, to where the players were being asked to participate because of a financial partnership between the Pentagon and the National Football League. And so once you make it into something that's much more even than just salute to flag, God, and country, and you turn it into something that's like salute the war on terror and our global war against, whoever the boogeyman of the month was, that made players feel like, okay, this is space where I'm going to register my dissent about what's happening in the world.
I think I know the answer to this, but do you think the national anthem should be played at sports events? Do you see any way that it would stop?
It's interesting. Mark Cuban, the franchise owner of the Dallas Mavericks, he said he was going to stop playing the national anthem at Mavericks games because, in his words, it was too divisive. And I thought that was an amazing sign of the times. Now, the Texas state legislature, who are completely off the beam. I don't need to explain why I'm saying that. If I have to justify it, you're probably not on this pod, or I'm sorry, on this stream. But the Texas state legislature actually passed legislation saying that Mark Cuban could not do that. And so much for freedom of a private business, which I thought they revered so dearly in Texas. But they nixed that. And Mark Cuban backed down very meekly. But it says something that the franchise owner of an NBA team, even one who's, a bit, off the beaten track, marches to the beat of his own drummer like Mark Cuban, would have that kind of consciousness where he says, yeah, this is going to be too divisive, so we can't play the national anthem. But no, I didn't answer your question, though. No, I don't want the national anthem at sporting events. Not at all.
You include some interviews with white athletes who took the knee in college sports and are identified as allies. What do you think is qualitatively different in the experience of the white athletes that you interviewed and the Black athletes who took a knee? Does it represent a different kind of commitment?
It's a different kind of commitment, and it's generally a different kind of result. Because your people will still throw slings and arrows at you, but you tend to make it out the other side a little more intact. And whether that's because of just the mere facts about whiteness and how it's seen in our society. But, I was very struck, and she was very struck. I'm talking about Megan Rapinoe, who was the first white athlete to take a knee after Colin Kaepernick, in addition to being a soccer superstar and a household name and all the rest of it. But Megan has wrestled a great deal with this idea of like, okay, Colin Kaepernick took a knee, I took a knee. 5 years later, Colin Kaepernick's dreams get, fricasseed, and he can't play on an NFL field anymore. They've taken his livelihood away from him because he dared say police violence is bad. And I'm kind of bigger than ever. Like, I'm an icon. You know, I was starred in the World Cup and all the rest of it. Now, some of that is about the differences between the worlds of soccer and professional football, but a lot of it really does have to do with whiteness. And I feel like the people who I spoke to, you know, they did get, you know, it wasn't without cost when they made these efforts. And you know, they believe very strongly by the credo that actually white people have an obligation, have a moral responsibility to be part of the struggle. And far too few white athletes thought that, but the ones who did, I think, proved in practice that, you know, this is the way forward, is that we need to try to build, you know, multiracial struggles against racism that even affects people who are not like the other people who are protesting, you know, that we actually come together to make these kinds of demands. And that's a discussion between white people that needs to happen, because when you drill down on the statistics of the polls about, you know, is America, you know, okay with Colin Kaepernick kneeling? Like, I've had people ask me about, like, how do you defend Colin Kaepernick polarizing this country? And, you know, the first way I answer that is to say, you know, well, Colin Kaepernick's not polarizing this country at all. Racism and police brutality is polarizing this country. And secondly, when you talk about polarization, what they're usually referring to are polls that show a very sort of even split in, do you support or not support him doing this? But when you drill down into the polls, you see he has overwhelming support amongst Black and brown communities for doing this. Like, the split is among the white community. That's where the split is. That's where the debate is. And that's where the debate needs to be, at kitchen tables, in workplaces. You know, the effort to see that, you know, what the white athletes in my book, what they're doing is actually a way forward, away from not just inactivity and passivity, but from a liberal mode of fighting racism, where you just feel, you know, a lot of guilt, and you're like looking within yourself, but, you know, something that aims more towards dismantling structural racism and aims more towards like concrete acts of solidarity.
Now, you don't interview Colin Kaepernick for the book. You must have tried, or did you deliberately not interview him? Or
it's interesting.
What happened there?
At first, it's like, would I want to interview Colin Kaepernick? Of course I'd want to interview Colin Kaepernick for this book. Absolutely, positively. And I'd interviewed him before. And, you know, and we've are able to contact each other and the like. And so, yeah, at first I did a big push to try to do it. He's doing his own thing. He's got a Netflix special coming out next year, a child's book about his life growing up. More work that he's doing around prison abolition. I mean, he's got a lot lined up for the next year. So I think partly he didn't want to make it like he was doing something else, like spreading himself too thin. The second thing, though, is I think after the initial couple weeks of trying to land the interview and, you know, just being very politely like, yeah, probably not. I sort of moved into a different mode of thinking, you know what, it's actually better. You know, maybe I'm certainly making a virtue out of a necessity, but I, you know, was thinking maybe it's better that I'm not interviewing him, because maybe what this book is really about is decentering Colin Kaepernick, certainly decentering myself in terms of my own voice in the book, and centering the voices of the people who were affected by what he did and then took the struggle to their own communities. Like that, let's center those voices for a while, because like we started this session by discussing, like I was worried about these folks being forgotten. And because we've seen too many narratives where that takes place, where mass struggle becomes about one spectacular individual. You know, and frankly, every social struggle in history, you can point to examples like this. And I would argue that that's actually a tool to make people feel disempowered, you know, to make people feel like, you know, oh, if I'm not this exceptional person, you know, then I'm not even a part of the conversation about how to make the world a better place.
So obviously you think that the Kaepernick effect is about more than Colin Kaepernick, but tell us what you think is the importance of his contribution. Could it have been any prominent black player who set in motion the events you describe, or was he uniquely positioned to spark a massive response?
Well, it's interesting because things were so hot in the summer of 2016. You know, a lot of athletes were taking to social media to speak out about what was happening in the country. Because if you remember that summer, that's when Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were both killed by police, and really consecutive days video was released of them being murdered, of them being killed by police, and there would be no repercussions. And you know, the streets were angry, people were upset, you know, and Colin Kaepernick was one of those upset people who was posting stuff. But if you'd asked me then, who's going to be the athlete who's going to become like the avatar for the era, I never would have guessed Colin Kaepernick on that front, because he'd always been extremely soft-spoken. But for people who'd been following his social media closely, he was putting out like, you know, very intense articles that were very theoretically based about police violence and jails and white supremacy and how it works with capitalism, like these. So these were the kind of ideas that he was swimming in at that time. And if I'd had a closer eye, I wouldn't have been as surprised. But you know, what's that line? I think it's from Shakespeare about some people are born great and some have greatness thrust upon them. Yeah. I mean, I think this was really thrust upon Colin, because, you know, when he first started protesting, he didn't send out a press release. He didn't even send out a tweet. All he did was sit on the bench behind his teammates, and it could have been unnoticed. If it wasn't for one reporter who I interview in the book, it could have gone through that 1 week. It could have been just Colin Kaepernick feeling very disgusted with what was happening in the world. So he sits down, but this is just where history just, you know, starts to crackle, and these connections that, you know, a mere little butterfly effect could have changed all of this. But, you know, the reporter, Steve Weish, asked Colin why he sat, and because Steve Weish had been following Colin's social media, so all credit to him. And Colin unleashed with talking about police getting away with murder, and spoke about it with great passion. And then that started a firestorm. And so Colin Kaepernick then had to speak to this former Green Beret and NFL player named Nate Boyer about, what can I do? They're all saying this is about, you know, me not liking the troops and, you know, tearing down the flag. I'm trying to raise a discussion about police violence, you know, please. And Nate Boyer said, well, I've got this idea. How about you take a knee in front of your team instead of sitting behind your team? Because it'll look like, you know, you respect the solemnity of the situation while at the same time raising your dissent. And they both thought that was good. I mean, it's almost comedic, like this idea of, they thought that would calm people down, taking a knee in front of the team, because the opposite took place. You know, they learned the hard way, to put it mildly, that if people don't like your message, they're not going to care how you dress up the messenger. And
maybe sitting seems more passive, and people are more content with that, and kneeling seems more active, and it seems more in your face, and prompts more of a reaction, which is the intent.
That's right. I think that's right. I mean, people have asked me that question too, like, why the knee? You know, what is it about that? And I think, you know, there are a lot of different parts of that, but like, one, there is a tradition of going on one knee to protest that goes back to the civil rights movement. So people could be recalling the image of people taking to one knee in front of a site where there might have been an instance of police brutality or dogs and fire hoses. But there's also, in sports, the idea of taking a knee is really iconic. You know, any coach knows that. All right, take a knee, you know. So it's this familiar posture for the athlete when you're in a state of intense listening, you know, to the coach. So it's like, it's a posture of intensity. And for Colin Kaepernick to do that, I think it freaked out not just Donald Trump and his minions, but the franchise owners of the National Football League. It caused an absolute freak out among them, not just because they couldn't believe that he was talking about police violence during their beautiful pageantry, salute to the troops, partnership with the Pentagon, you know, festivities, but it was also just so powerful and so dangerous to them, because this is a very authoritarian top-down league. You know, the average career is only 3 years. The contracts aren't guaranteed. And this was a case of a player not doing what he was supposed to do and not acting like he was supposed to act. And, you know, if the racial contradictions in the National Football League are so sharp that any sort of protest that's related to racism, it's like pulling a string, you know, and the whole sweater comes apart. Like when you have a league that's 70% African-American, no Black American franchise owners, and just a scant handful of Black executives and head coaches. I mean, and given the sheer amount of bodily punishment that a player goes through, I mean, that's a recipe. That's a very, very volatile recipe. And Colin Kaepernick, like, really dragged all that out into the sunlight, even if that wasn't his intention. Like, and there were several things that have happened that I would argue were not Colin's intention, but it's just the fallout of him taking that knee and the spreading of the consciousness, and athletes, particularly Black athletes, starting to ask, what is my role in this? And where is it unjust? And what are you going to do about it? I think that's led to other changes that are significant, like the loosening up of rules of NCAA athletes. I think it's absolutely connected to Kaepernick taking that knee. I think the Washington football team changing its name from the racist slur that it was intrinsically connected to the ways in which the Black Lives Matter movement was brought into sports. And, you know, that's another one of his contributions. No one has done that quite like Colin Kaepernick.
And the transformation that it makes in the lives of the people who followed his example and took that step and took that knee.
Yeah, and that's why I keep stressing this idea that he offered a language and a method to these young folks, because by offering that language and that method, he gave them a way to be political when before he did, they were just angry. And so the ability to turn anger into action is so potent in our society, and it's precious. It's much more rare than it should be.
Well, you've been writing about sports and politics for years. I'd be interested to know what you make of fans who say that they don't want to get their political opinions from athletes. They just want to watch them play.
I say, if you don't like their political opinions, then you don't have to listen to them. But the idea that you're signing away your right to be political because you're a professional athlete, I mean, that needs to go the way of the dodo bird, because, you know, these are human beings out there, not robots. And, you know, if they're good enough to cheer for, then they should at least be seen as human enough to listen to. That's what I would say to that.
What about for the athletes? Is there an affirmative obligation on the part of athletes and sports figures to speak to political issues?
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that depends on the moment. Like in more placid times, I would say, you know, no one has to be political. There's also no obligation to be political just because you sign a sports contract, and maybe you don't have anything to say about the topic that's of any interest, but, you know, you feel like you need to speak anyway, and you know, people don't want to look like people don't want to be held up for ridicule because they don't understand the issue. And so I definitely wouldn't say people just sort of have to be political, even if they don't want to be. I mean, and this debate goes back to the civil rights movement. Willie Mays once had a quote where he said, I'll back the players who want to be political, but they should back me that I don't want to be political. I was like, Willie Mays said that. So this is an old debate about, like, okay, so there's this legacy of athletic revolt. Do you have a responsibility to carry that forward or not? And I got to tell you, 99% of political athletes that I've spoken to over the years, no matter the sport, no matter the age, 99%, I can only think of one exception, I've said, if you don't want to be political, you don't have to be political. Just have space for those of us who want to be, and respect that space. That's been the overwhelming position of the athletes who've actually done the work with whom I've spoken. One said to me, of course they should be political. Why should they be allowed to hide and be cowards? But that was just one person. But
well, you do wonder what people think, and athletes are someone who you come to respect and revere. And you wonder what I think about Bob Uecker in connection with this, the
Mm.
voice of the Milwaukee Brewers. I listen to a lot of Brewers games on radio and have for years. I probably have heard Bob Uecker talk for hundreds, if not thousands of hours, not just, doing the play-by-play, but telling stories of his life and career on and on. I don't have the slightest idea where he stands on any political issue. I mean, am I being deprived of something there? Am I missing out on something that he really should be sharing?
I don't know. If I would say, hey, Bob, are you part of the mainstream? And he might say, just a bit outside. Joke.
I'm pretty sure he's not like, a Trump Republican, because, he is Bob Uecker. I mean, he's who he is, and he's awesome.
He's awesome. He's Bob Uecker. I mean, he's a national treasure. I love Ueck. I must be in the front row. But the thing about it is, like, if he doesn't want to be political, then more power to him. But if Bob Uecker ever did say, you know what, a passion in my life is, offshore oil drilling, and I want to explain to you, the listening audience, why, it's like, why not? I mean, as long as it's not obviously right in the middle of a game, like it's a protest or something. But it's like, if he wants to let folks know what he thinks about things, he should be able to without worrying about his job or anything like that. That's more where I'm coming from on this. And I'm really proud of this generation of athletes who step forward. Like, I've been doing this for a hot minute, and these last 10 years, particularly the last 5 years, have been like, I don't know, like living in a wind tunnel. It's just been like this nonstop deluge of the politicization of sports. And in the years that I wrote about it before 2012, I really do mark 2012 as the turning point, because that's the year that the Miami Heat protested the murder of Trayvon Martin, and they sent out a photo of them all in hoodies. And that was like the first viral sports politics photo. And social media is such a part of this discussion in terms of how it's changed the relationship between the athlete and the public. But it's just to say, I never thought I'd see something like this, and so soon. And it's been inspiring. It's made me much more optimistic than I have any right to be.
What role should what role should fans play in relation to this, in terms of encouraging athletes to, or tolerating or accepting athletes as they speak out on issues like racial injustice or climate change or getting vaccinated? Where are the fans in this? What is their role?
I think, like, if a player, first of all, excuse me, if a player isn't going to stand for the anthem, it's like, show them solidarity and don't stand either. Right there in the stands, he's taking a risk or she's taking a risk. We can take risks too as fans. And our risk, probably the worst thing, is someone's going to say something smart to us. Worst case scenario, if you're at a Raiders game, someone might pour a beer on your head. But I bet in Green Bay, Wisconsin, people would be very polite. Or not. I have no idea. But it's like the athletes risking, their job, their livelihood, all kinds of stuff. So, I think having some solidarity in the stands is a good thing. I think, but short of that, I mean, I think, like, just the social media stuff really does matter. I mean, there's a lot of downtime that comes with being a pro athlete, and they're on their socials a great deal. And so searching their names and the like. So putting out statements of support and solidarity, even something like that, you'd be surprised about what that does to the confidence of somebody who's sort of putting themselves out there to do something. And then the last thing that I think fans can do, if they're supportive of what we're talking about, is to build the movement. Because one thing that you see historically, and you've certainly seen this over the last 10 years, is that it's the building of the movement that creates the condition for athletes to be political. No movement, no political athletes. That doesn't happen. The political athlete thing does not happen in a vacuum. So what matters is what we do off the playing field, far more than what matters in terms of just sitting around for the next Muhammad Ali to make a magical appearance.
So you spoke before about how team owners and NFL as a whole was kind of taken by surprise and aghast at the Colin Kaepernick and his example. Are there some organizations that got it right? Are there some sports owners who did the right thing with regard to the right of players to protest?
Yeah, I mean, with one incredibly notable exception, the franchise owners of the WNBA, the Women's National Basketball Association, have the franchise owners have understood that having political athletes is not a monetary death knell, that actually fans could become more invested in what you're doing if they're invested in the players as real human beings. And, you know, they're really also taking a page from the women of U.S. soccer. But the institutions that govern women's soccer are terrible on this stuff. Like, they've done it from below organically. I think the franchise owners of the WNBA said, well, what if we just make it clear to players that we've got their back from the beginning? And so that's led to some very interesting things, like teams that do support Planned Parenthood night, for example. That's like a franchise activity. It's very interesting. And that's bonded team to community in a way that I think maybe some folks would have bet never would have happened, that it wouldn't be a step forward for your organization. And of course, I said with one exception, when I was talking about the franchise owners, I'm talking about former Senator Kelly Loeffler, who owned 49% of the Atlanta Dream and decided to make the criticizing of her own players for supporting the Black Lives Matter movement one of her planks, for goodness sakes, about like I'm willing to step on the players on this team. And I'm going to ruin them for the purposes of showing that I'm a friend of Donald Trump and a bigot just like him, and please elect me over this weird Raphael Warnock fella. And the WNBA players, when she did that, they mounted a elect Warnock campaign, like wearing t-shirts every day. There were actually a lot of people, I know this from interviewing some of the players, like they were on Zoom, like debating Warnock and talking to him about his policies and trying to make sure that they were like in line with what they believed. And so they like actually helped shape the campaign through their own advocacy, while at the same time pushing back against Kelly Loeffler. And the part of this story that's so delectable is that one of the players on the Atlanta Dream is a person named Renee Montgomery. And when Kelly Loeffler started with her bigoted rants about the WNBA players, Renee Montgomery asked if she could sit down with Kelly Loeffler. And Kelly Loeffler refused to meet with her. And Kelly Loeffler, after she lost the Senate race, was expunged from the WNBA. They basically made her sell her shares. And one of the minority owners in the people who bought her shares was Renee Montgomery. So the same person who Kelly Loeffler wouldn't meet with is now in the big chair. And Kelly Loeffler has been exiled to Siberia or wherever it is failed Trump candidates go.
And Warnock is doing is become a great addition to the U.S. Senate.
I mean, that's world historic when you factor in the Senate majorities that Biden's choosing not to use.
So we had said that there would be an opportunity for questions from our viewing audience. Norm, is there any questions that you have that have come in or that you would have to ask?
We are still looking for more questions to come in. You can chat them on the YouTube channel by chatting in the comments there, or on our Facebook page. And while we're waiting for some of those, I do want to mention again, you can get a copy of the book, The Kaepernick Effect. It's brand new. It just came out less than a week ago. And you can get a copy of that book with a donation to the Progressive Magazine. $50 or more, we'll mail it to your home. And so please go to progressive.org/book event if you want to get a copy of that book. And also, again, want to thank A Room of One's Own bookstore that is co-sponsoring this event with us tonight. It's roomofonesown.com. You can also purchase this book and many others through their website, and they host a lot of different book events, and they've just moved to a new location on Atwood Avenue on Madison's East Side. So very exciting things happening for that local bookstore. And very exciting things happening here at the Progressive Magazine as well. We have a new issue coming out, which features an excerpt from Dave Zirin's book, The Kaepernick Effect, and it also features Dave Zirin's regular column, which appears in every issue of the Progressive Magazine. You can get that October-November issue if you subscribe now at progressive.org/subscribe, and it's very affordable, and you'll always find lots of great content in the magazine as well. Just going to check in on the questions here and let you guys wrap up for a minute while we check on that. But again, thanks to Room of One's Own for co-hosting tonight, and really appreciate all the work that local bookstores do in cities and towns all across the United States.
Yeah, 2 comments on that. Thanks so much, Norm. First is, when people ask me about where to buy the book, generally, I always say bookshop.org. Stay away from Amazon. Bookshop.org. All the stock comes from independent bookstores, and they're so desperately needed as a lifeblood of democracy in this country. I mean, it's amazing that we've gotten to this point, but without independent bookstores, the level of atomization and the level of ideas and discourse would be just, the atomization would go through the roof, and the public sharing of ideas would go down like a rock. So just a lot of support for that, and a lot of support for the Progressive. I mean, just a seminal, fundamental magazine in my own life. Growing up, reading Howard Zinn's column was just like the sort of thing you ran to when it came in the mail. And I just want everybody to support the magazine as well.
Thanks very much. And we do have some questions here. The first one is about the St. Louis versus the NFL case, the NFL case against St. Louis, and wondering whether St. Louis should settle. What can you tell us about that?
Well, only this is about the city having to pay for a stadium that's now no longer in use because the St. Louis Rams are now the Los Angeles Rams, and so they were basically held up by their owner Stan Kroenke, and he was a brigand. He absconded with public funds and left town. And so they're suing, and the NFL is saying basically, well, we have the right to gut any city we choose. And we're going to see what a St. Louis jury has to say about that. And I would just say to Howard Park, like, I would absolutely let the St. Louis jury assess damages, because there's a lot of hurt feelings in the city of St. Louis about this. Don't let them settle. Don't let them off the hook. Make them take full responsibility for doing this. It's the only way to prevent them from doing it to another city.
And we do have another question, but it's in Japanese, and I can't figure out how to make it auto-translate here. But obviously, we have international listeners to this program as well. Dave, I have a question for you, because you've written about the Olympics over and over again. You, of course, covered the Olympics in Brazil a few years ago, and now we had these Olympics in Tokyo this year in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. Do you have some words for us about that?
Just that I thought it was an obscenity. I mean, I'd been to Tokyo in 2019 to do some writing and to really inspect all the pre-Olympic planning. Of course, that was months before COVID. The vaccination rates in Tokyo are still very low. And so holding the Olympics in that context, in this very concentrated city that is Tokyo, I mean, it just felt like it was like an obscenity. I mean, there was already in Tokyo, you were seeing debt displacement and hyper-militarization of public space. That was already happening before the pandemic. And then the pandemic just not only shot all that stuff through the roof, but they created what basically amounted to maybe not a super spreader event, but the cases that came out to an unprotected population. I mean, it's unconscionable.
Related to that, I would put in a good word for your book, Brazil's Dance with the Devil, which is about the 2016 Olympics in Rio, which was written before the Olympics, and I read it a couple of years after the Olympics were over, and it held up remarkably well as a portrait of the country and the Olympics and all of the issues that it involved.
Yeah, I don't use the word Bolsonaro in the book once, but you really would see the future in that level of doom by what I was describing and seeing in Rio at that time, like the level of inequality, the level of dissatisfaction. I mean, that can just prove to be such a breeding ground for the right, not necessarily the left. And Bolsonaro took advantage of that.
Yeah. Well, I think that we should wrap up. I have one more question for you. At the end of each interview or each story that you tell, you give the subject a chance to reflect on what lessons they learned that they want to pass on. Here's your chance. What lessons should people take from the stories that you tell in the Kaepernick effect?
Wow. I mean, I think the lesson that shines through is that, pessimism is a luxury we cannot afford, because we have this young generation where a significant sector of them just isn't going to settle for the things that maybe other generations were willing to settle for. And so those of us who are not of that generation, we've got an obligation to have the backs of these kids. And if you do that, not only are you doing the right thing morally, not only are you doing the right thing politically, but you're also, I think, attaching yourself to something that is inherently optimistic, because it's this idea that we can live in a better world than the one we're living now. And that is desperately needed in 2021.
That's great. Well, let us end there. Everybody should get a copy of the book. It's a great book. You'll enjoy it, learn from it, and be glad that you read it.
And thanks very much to both of you. Bill Leaders, editor of the Progressive magazine, and Dave Zirin, regular columnist for the Progressive, The Nation, and host of the Edge of Sports podcast. Thank you so very much for joining us today for this virtual book event in a time when events are still predominantly virtual.
No, thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining us tonight here at the Progressive Magazine. We will continue to do these sorts of events as we can, and we appreciate all of your support. Again, if you'd like a copy of the book, you can make a donation to the Progressive Magazine and have a copy of the book mailed to your home. We're actually getting our copies here tomorrow, so we can ship those out pretty quickly. And it's very much worth the read. So please check it out. And again, thanks to A Room of One's Own bookstore for co-sponsoring this event. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight.